I never knew my job would lead me into this complex reality, but it was too late when I had gone deep into it. Now I will live with the regret for the rest of my life. The taxi pulled up to the household, a sprawling modern home with manicured lawns and a driveway lined with neatly trimmed hedges. The house exuded wealth, a stark contrast to the modest life I had left behind. I sat in the back seat for a moment, gathering my thoughts, my fingers adjusting the edge of my scarf. My reflection in the car window revealed nerves I couldn't quite hide, but I was determined. This was a new beginning, an opportunity one couldn't afford to waste. As I stepped out of the car, Julia Kent emerged from the front door. She was tall and graceful, her tailored pantsuit and warm smile a mix of professionalism and kindness. Her young daughter, Amelia, peeked out from behind her legs, a shy 2-year-old with bright eyes and soft curls. "Layla, welcome," Julia said, extending her hand. Her voice was welcoming, putting me slightly at ease. "Thank you," I replied, my accent soft but noticeable. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Amelia clung to Julia at first, her tiny hands clutching the fabric of her mother's trousers. But as I crouched down to her level and smiled, she hesitated, then offered a small wave. Julia beamed at the interaction. "She's a little shy with new people," Julia said, "but she'll warm up to you soon enough." Before I could respond, a figure appeared behind them. Mr. Kent stepped out of the house, his presence commanding but approachable. He was tall, dressed in a crisp shirt with the sleeves rolled up, exuding the quiet confidence of a successful man. He extended a firm handshake. "Layla, it's good to have you here," he said, his deep voice carrying an air of authority. I met his gaze briefly, then lowered mine, feeling a strange sense of vulnerability. "Thank you, Mr. Kent. I'm honored to be part of your household." As he stepped back, I couldn't help but notice how his eyes remained on me, not in an overt way, but enough to make me feel self-conscious. I dismissed it as my nerves playing tricks on me. Inside, the house was even more stunning. The open-plan living room was filled with natural light, with sleek furniture and thoughtful decor. A vase of fresh flowers sat on a glass table, and the faint scent of lavender filled the air. "This is your home now," Julia said warmly, showing me to the guest room. It was cozy and well-furnished, a space that felt more like a boutique hotel than staff quarters. As I unpacked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being both excited and overwhelmed. The Kents seemed kind, their home inviting, but I felt the weight of expectation. Amelia, peeking shyly from the hallway, eventually wandered into the room and handed me a small stuffed animal. "For you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I laughed gently and took the toy, thanking her in Arabic, which made her giggle. Julia, watching from the doorway, smiled approvingly. "She's taken to you already," she said. Later that evening, as I stood in the kitchen helping Julia with dinner, Mr. Kent walked in, loosening his tie. He leaned casually against the counter, engaging me in polite conversation. His questions about my background were simple, but his tone was curious, his eyes observant. "Your English is very good," he remarked. "Thank you," I replied, trying to ignore the way my cheeks warmed. "I studied it for years back home." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about my first day. I didn't know then how much this family would change my life, or how I would change theirs. The next morning, I was in the kitchen preparing Amelia's lunch. The soft morning light filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over the counters. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the coffee machine. Amelia was playing with her toys in the living room, her cheerful babble occasionally drifting into the kitchen. As I carefully sliced fruit for her snack, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw Mr. Kent walking in. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his tie undone, and he was holding an empty coffee mug. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm but low. "Good morning, Mr. Kent," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Please call me Daniel," he said, stepping closer as he placed his mug under the coffee machine. I nodded, feeling the room shrink slightly. Calling him by his first name felt strange, like a step into unfamiliar territory, but I didn't want to argue. He moved closer to the counter where I worked, his eyes following my hands as I carefully arranged slices of fruit. His gaze paused on me longer than usual, making my heart race. "That looks great," he said, his tone softer now. "You've really brought something special to this house." "Thank you," I replied, glancing at him briefly. His presence felt overwhelming, his words carrying a weight I couldn't quite explain. "Do you miss your family?" he asked, his voice almost tender. "Yes," I admitted, keeping my focus on the task in front of me. "I miss them every day. But this was a choice I made for them. For a better life." He reached out, his hand touching against mine as I worked. I froze, my breath catching as he turned to face me fully. "You're remarkable, Layla," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Everything you do, the way you handle things, you're more than just a nanny here." I wanted to respond, to defuse the moment, but the words wouldn't come. I felt him step closer, the warmth of his body invading the space between us. As he leaned in slightly, his face now just inches from mine, I could feel the heat of his breath. His lips hovered near me, and I panicked, remembering the warnings I had been given before coming here. Back home, they told me about situations like this. How men could blur the lines of professionalism, how easy it was to lose everything if you didn't stay vigilant. "Mr. Kent," I said softly, my voice trembling. "Please." He paused, his expression shifting as if realizing the weight of the moment. He pulled back slightly, his eyes scanning my face for a reaction. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, stepping back and running a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean to." "I'm sorry." I nodded, still gripping the counter for support. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the coffee machine. "I should go check on Amelia," I said, my voice unsteady. Without waiting for a reply, I stepped out of the kitchen, my heart pounding as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The sun was warm on my skin as we strolled through the park. Amelia's giggles filled the air as she ran ahead to the playground, her small feet kicking up bits of gravel. Mr. Kent, walking beside me, seemed more at ease than I'd ever seen him. "Thank you for joining us," he said, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. "It's nice to get out of the house for a change." "It's good for Amelia," I replied, watching her climb onto the swings. "And for you, I think." He laughed, a sound so genuine it surprised me. "You're not wrong. It feels like I'm always juggling 10 things at once. Sometimes I forget to just breathe." I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to admit. Leaving my family to come here felt like that, like juggling. It was the hardest decision I've ever made. He turned to me, his expression softening. "I can't imagine how much you've had to sacrifice. It must be incredibly hard." "It is," I said quietly, glancing down at the path. "But Amelia makes it easier. She's a joy to be around." We shared a brief laugh over one of Amelia's antics on the playground, but the air between us felt heavier than it should have. There was something in the way he looked at me, not pity, but admiration. "You're stronger than most people I know," he said after a pause. I looked up at him, unsure of how to respond. The sincerity in his voice left me disarmed, and for a moment we walked in silence. By the time we reached the swings, I couldn't ignore the quiet pull between us, though neither of us dared to name it. The house was unusually quiet, with Amelia down for her nap and Julia away at a meeting. I was tidying the living room, folding blankets and arranging cushions, when I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw Mr. Kent walking in, loosening his tie as he always did after a long day. "You don't have to do all that," he said with a small smile, motioning to the cushions I was meticulously aligning. "It's my job," I replied lightly, though his presence made me more aware of every small movement. He sat down on the couch, leaning back and exhaling deeply. "You do so much more than just your job, Layla," he said after a pause. "Amelia adores you. Julia and I couldn't have asked for anyone better to be here for her." The sincerity in his tone caught me off guard. "Thank you, Mr. Kent." "That means a lot," I said, placing the last cushion in place and turning to face him. "Please," he said, sitting up slightly, "call me Daniel." I hesitated but nodded. "Okay, Daniel." The way he looked at me then was different, softer, more personal. He rested his elbows on his knees, his gaze steady. "Do you ever think about what you gave up to come here?" he asked. His question took me by surprise. Every day, I admitted. Leaving my family wasn't easy, but I wanted to give them a better future. This was the only way I could think to do that. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's incredible. You've made so many sacrifices, yet you've built something so meaningful here. You've done more for this family than you realize." His words struck a chord, and for the first time, I felt truly seen, not just as a nanny, but as a person. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. As I stood near the couch, he reached out, gently taking my hand. I froze, unsure of how to react, but I didn't pull away. His hand was warm, his touch firm yet comforting. "Layla," he said quietly, his voice carrying an intimacy that made my heart race. We stood there, our hands intertwined, the space between us disappearing. He reached up slowly, adjusting the loose tie on my scarf, his fingers rested against my skin. The gesture was tender, almost protective, and I couldn't bring myself to stop him. When his hands moved to my waist, I felt my breath catch. He held me there, his grip light but deliberate, his eyes searching mine. "Daniel," I whispered, the word a plea as much as a warning. "This isn't right." He tilted his head slightly, his expression softening. "Then tell me to stop," he said, his voice calm but filled with unspoken emotion. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. My heart was torn between the loyalty I felt for the family I served and the feelings I couldn't deny any longer. I began, but the truth caught in my throat. He smiled then, as if he understood the turmoil in my heart. Slowly, he stepped back, releasing me. "I'm sorry," he said simply, his voice sincere. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." Before I could respond, he turned and left the room, leaving me standing there, frozen. For the rest of the afternoon, my thoughts were a whirlwind. The weight of what had almost happened, the feelings I had been trying to suppress, and the reality of my position all collided in my mind. I wanted to believe it was just a moment, a fleeting lapse in judgment, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I had fallen for him. It was a Friday evening, and the house was unusually quiet. Julia had called earlier to say she'd be working late, leaving just Mr. Kent, Daniel, and me to finish the evening routine with Amelia. After Amelia had been tucked into bed, I found myself alone in the kitchen, clearing away the remnants of dinner. The sound of running water and the clink of dishes provided a familiar rhythm, though my thoughts were anything but steady. As I wiped down the counter, Daniel entered the kitchen. He had removed his tie and rolled up his sleeves, looking far more relaxed than usual. "Need any help?" he asked, his tone casual, though there was an edge of something I couldn't quite place. "I've got it," I replied, offering a polite smile. He ignored my answer and moved closer, reaching for a plate to load into the dishwasher. "You've done enough for one day," he said, his voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. We worked side by side in silence for a while, the air between us growing heavier with every passing moment. Every now and then, his hand touched mine as we passed dishes, and though it was unintentional, it was enough to send a spark through me. "Thank you, Layla," he said suddenly, breaking the quiet. I glanced at him, surprised. "For what?" "For everything you do here," he said, his gaze steady. "Amelia adores you, and I can see why. You've brought so much light into this house." I felt my cheeks warm at his words. "That's kind of you to say. I just try to do my job." "It's more than that," he said, turning to face me fully. "You're more than just a nanny to us." His words hung in the air, and I found myself unable to look away from him. The intensity in his eyes was disarming, and I felt my pulse quicken. "Daniel," I began, my voice faltering as I struggled to find the right words. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. My breath hitched as the space between us disappeared. He reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from my face. His fingers delayed for a moment before he let them drop, his gaze searching mine. Neither of us spoke. The room was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, but it felt as though the world had stopped around us. Without thinking, without planning, we both leaned in. The kiss was brief, soft, and hesitant, but it carried a weight neither of us could deny. My heart raced as our lips met, and for a moment I lost my senses. It had been so long I felt something like this. I had slowly forgotten about my boyfriend Hassan. Mr. Kent brought me to the edge of the kitchen cabinet, and we did it twice. He thought we were done. I then knelt down. He watched me and smiled. We did it twice again. Then, just as quickly as it began, it ended. We pulled back, both of us wide-eyed and breathless. I'm sorry, I stammered, stepping back and turning away. Layla, he began, his voice soft, but I shook my head. I should go, I said, avoiding his gaze as I grabbed the dish towel and moved toward the door. Good night, Mr. Kent. He didn't stop me, but his expression was etched with a mix of regret and something deeper, something neither of us dared to name. As I left the kitchen, my thoughts were a whirlwind of guilt and confusion. I didn't know how to reconcile what had just happened with my role in their lives, but one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same. It was a quiet afternoon, and the house was bathed in the soft glow of sunlight streaming through the windows. Amelia was napping, and I was folding laundry in the living room. Daniel entered unexpectedly, his expression light as he greeted me. You're always working, he said, shaking his head. You deserve a break. I smiled politely, but before I could reply, he stepped closer. Layla, he began softly, his voice filled with something that felt too personal. I just wanted to say how much I appreciate you being here. Not just for Amelia, but for everything. I felt my heart tighten, his words stirring emotions I had tried so hard to suppress. He moved closer, his arms hesitating for a moment before pulling me into a hug. It was warm, comforting, but filled with an intimacy I knew crossed a line. Just as I was about to pull away, the sound of the front door opening froze us both in place. Julia stood there, her eyes wide with shock as she took in the scene. What is going on here? She demanded, her voice cold and sharp. Julia, Daniel began, stepping back quickly, his face pale. It's not what it looks like, not what it looks like, she interrupted, her gaze darting between us. You're hugging the nanny in my house, Daniel. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of her fury was too much to bear. Layla, Julia said, her tone firm and final. Pack your things. You're no longer needed here. I felt my chest tighten, tears threatening to fall as I nodded silently and retreated upstairs to gather my belongings. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more captivating tales. Now it's your turn to share your thoughts. Did Julia do the right thing by sacking Layla, or should she have handled it differently? And if you were in her position, would you divorce Daniel over this? Let us know in the comments below.